Before he died, Gregory Peck finally said something about Robert Mitchum that has stunned Hollywood. Not a scandal, not a rumor, but a truth far more unsettling, a truth that quietly shattered the myth of the good man and the bad rebel and revealed how dangerously wrong we had been about both. For decades, Gregory Peck was Hollywood's moral compass, the calm voice of reason, the man who played justice, dignity, and quiet as strength so convincingly that audiences believed he was those things in real life. And Robert Mitchum, he was the opposite, the outlaw, the troublemaker, the man Hollywood loved to whisper about. So when Peck, a man who avoided gossip his entire life, chose to speak honestly about Mitchum near the end of his days, people leaned in, because Gregory Peck never spoke unless it mattered. And what he revealed was not about rebellion or bad behavior. It was about discipline, pain, and the kind of sadness that turns men into legends. But to understand why Peck's words carried so much weight, we first need to understand the man himself. Gregory Peck was born Eldred Gregory Peck on April 5, 1916 in La Jolla, California. His early life was shaped by separation and silence. His parents divorced when he was still a child, an emotional rupture that left a permanent mark. That absence, that early fracture of family, would later echo through many of the restrained, introspective men he portrayed on a screen. Raised primarily by his grandmother, Peck grew up in a household defined by discipline, moral clarity, and quiet expectation. There was no indulgence, no chaos, only a structure, responsibility, and the unspoken lesson that character mattered more than charm. As a young man, he enrolled at the University of California, Berkeley, with plans to study medicine. But something inside him resisted that path. Literature pulled at him. Public speaking awakened something deeper. Theater, in particular, gave him a language for the questions he couldn't articulate out loud. On stage, Peck discovered not only his voice, but his purpose. That realization led him to abandon medicine and move to New York City, where he enrolled at the neighborhood Playhouse School of the Theater. There, he studied under the legendary Sanford Meisner, learning the discipline of restraint, truth, and emotional economy. Acting was not about excess, it was about control. Those lessons would define his entire career. By the time he made his film debut in Days of Glory in 1944, Hollywood immediately sensed something different. Peck did not project arrogance. He carried intelligence without cruelty, authority without aggression. He was powerful precisely because he did not need to dominate. And soon, he became one of the most respected leading men of his era. Films like Gentleman's Agreement, 12 O'Clock High, and later To Kill a Mockingbird didn't just make him famous, they made him trusted. Audiences believed him when he spoke about justice because he lived as though justice mattered, which is exactly why, decades later, his words about Robert Mitchum landed like a quiet thunderclap. Because if a man like Gregory Peck said something surprising, it meant it was true. And what he said next would completely redefine Robert Mitchum, not as a rebel, but as something far more dangerous to Hollywood's comfort. Hollywood loved simple stories. It loved clean lines, easy labels, and neat contrasts. So it decided, almost instinctively, that Gregory Peck and Robert Mitchum came from opposite worlds. Peck was cast as the conscience. Mitchum was cast as the outlaw. One wore integrity like a tailored suit. The other wore defiance like a shadow across his face. And for years, that version of the story was enough. But near the end of his life, Peck admitted something few expected. He said, The comparison was convenient, but dangerously incomplete. People like to pretend we came from opposite ends of Hollywood, Peck once reflected. I was supposed to be the clean-cut conscience, and Bob was cast as the rebel. The truth, he said, was far more complicated. What the public never understood about Mitchum was not his scandals, his arrests, or his sardonic humor. It was his discipline. That was the shocking part. Peck revealed that beneath Mitchum's laid-back posture and half-lidded gaze was an actor who worked relentlessly. He prepared obsessively. He studied the scripts with quiet intensity. He understood something most performers never fully grasped, that power on a screen does not come from doing more, but from doing less. Mitchum knew when to stay silent. Peck recalled watching him turn minimal dialogue into moments that lingered long after the scene ended. A glance, a pause, a breath held just a second longer than expected. Those choices were not accidents. They were calculated, controlled. That kind of control, Peck said, doesn't come from laziness. It comes from confidence and intelligence. To Hollywood executives, Mitchum often appeared indifferent, even reckless. But Peck saw something else entirely. He saw a man who refused to perform sincerity for approval. Mitchum didn't want to please the room. He wanted to tell the truth, even if it made people uncomfortable. And then there was the humor. Most people mistook Mitchum's dry wit for cynicism, for detachment, for disdain. Peck disagreed. He believed humor was Mitchum's armor. Bob used humor the way some men use a shield, Peck explained. It kept people at a distance, but it also kept him honest. Mitchum, Peck believed, was acutely aware of Hollywood's hypocrisies. He saw how images were manufactured, how morality was marketed, how rebellion could be sold just as easily as virtue, and he refused to pretend otherwise. That refusal came at a cost. Peck admitted that behind Mitchum's reputation was a deep emotional sensitivity few ever noticed. He felt things intensely, perhaps too intensely, and he had no interest in displaying that vulnerability publicly. Bob carried a kind of sadness, Peck said quietly, and he didn't know what to do with it, except turn it into art. In Peck's view, Mitchum's personal struggles were not signs of moral failure. They were symptoms of a restless spirit. A man who could not settle comfortably into a world that demanded masks. And that sadness, unresolved, unsoftened, gave Mitchum's performances their haunting quality. The sense that something was always simmering beneath the surface. Something unspoken. Something real. Peck concluded this reflection with a statement that felt almost elegiac. If Bob had wanted to be safer, more respectable, he could have been, he said. But then he wouldn't have been Robert Mitchum. In that moment, Gregory Peck did not dismantle Mitchum's legend. He refined it. In his final reflections, Gregory Peck moved beyond Robert Mitchum, the actor, and began talking about something much larger, greatness. He believed Hollywood had always been uncomfortable with men it couldn't neatly categorize, men who refused to fully obey the rules, men who exposed contradictions simply by existing. Mitchum, in Peck's eyes, was one of those men. Hollywood wanted rebellion that could be controlled, edginess that could be packaged, danger that never truly threatened the system. But Mitchum didn't play along. He didn't soften himself for interviews. He didn't apologize convincingly. He didn't reshape his personality to reassure studios or audiences. And that, Peck suggested, was why Mitchum was often misunderstood. Peck explained that the industry mistook Mitchum's independence for indifference. His refusal to flatter power was seen as arrogance. His silence was interpreted as laziness. In reality, Peck said, Mitchum simply refused to fake reverence for an industry he saw clearly. He wasn't interested in pleasing the room, Peck once remarked. He was interested in telling the truth. And truth, Peck believed, is always disruptive. What made this revelation so powerful was who it came from. Gregory Peck was not a rebel. He did not tear down Hollywood. He worked within it, navigated it carefully, and used its platform to tell morally grounded stories. Yet even he acknowledged that Hollywood needed men like Mitchum, artists who reminded the industry that sincerity cannot be manufactured, that authenticity often looks messy, that contradiction is not weakness, but humanity. Peck admitted that if Mitchum had chosen the safer path, he could have enjoyed a cleaner reputation. He could have played the game more carefully. He could have avoided scandal and suspicion. But then something essential would have been lost. Mitchum's performances carried weight precisely because they were born from conflict, from tension, from a man who felt deeply but refused to sentimentalize his pain. That unresolved sadness Peck spoke of, quiet, heavy, and ever-present, was not a flaw. It was the source. And Peck, a man known for restraint and dignity, recognized that truth with humility. In revealing this perspective, Peck wasn't offering gossip. He was offering a final lesson that art does not come from perfection. It comes from friction, from men and women brave enough to remain themselves, even when it costs them comfort. And in that sense, Peck believed Mitchum had succeeded in the most difficult way possible, not by being admired, but by being honest. As Gregory Peck entered the final years of his life, he did not chase relevance. He didn't rewrite his image. He didn't look back with bitterness. And he certainly didn't try to reshape history in his favor. Instead, he grew quieter. For a man whose presence once filled the largest screens in the world, Peck chose reflection over performance. Those who knew him described a calm acceptance, a deep sense of gratitude, and an increasing focus on faith, conscience, and legacy. He understood that fame fades, but values do not. In those quiet years, Peck became even more selective with his words. That is why his reflections on Robert Mitchum carried such gravity. He wasn't correcting the record for headlines. He was speaking as one artist to history, offering clarity where myth had replaced truth. Peck knew he would be remembered as Atticus Finch, as the face of moral courage, as the man who stood for justice when the world felt uncertain. And he accepted that legacy with humility, but he also wanted something else to survive him, an understanding that goodness is not always loud, that rebellion is not always shallow, and that art, at its best, is born from contradiction. On June 12, 2003, Gregory Peck passed away peacefully in his sleep. There was no spectacle, no dramatic farewell, just a quiet closing of the curtain. He was mourned not only as a Hollywood legend, but as a man of principle, someone who carried dignity without performance and conviction without cruelty. He left behind his devoted family, his children, and a body of work that continued to speak long after his voice was gone. His remains were laid to rest at the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels Mausoleum in Los Angeles, a place of stillness and reverence, a fitting resting place for a man whose life had been guided by conscience. And yet, even in death, Peck was still teaching. By speaking honestly about Robert Mitchum, he reminded the world that legends are not carved from simplicity. They are shaped by tension, by flaws, by courage, and by truth. In the end, Gregory Peck did not reveal a shocking secret. he revealed something far more enduring, that greatness does not belong to the perfect. It belongs to the authentic. And sometimes the most honest stories are told only when a man knows his time is nearly done. By the time the final curtain fell, Gregory Peck understood something most people never fully grasp. Hollywood remembers faces, but history remembers truth. Peck knew his image had been carefully shaped over decades, the moral man, the steady voice, the embodiment of justice. And while much of that image was earned, he also understood that no human life fits neatly into a single role. That was why his final words about Robert Mitchum mattered so deeply. They weren't meant to shock. They weren't meant to provoke controversy. They were meant to balance the story. Peck had lived long enough to see how myths harden into history, how rebellion gets simplified, how virtue gets polished, and how the real, complicated human beings behind the legends slowly disappear. So he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but honestly. In doing so, he offered one last gift to cinema, a reminder that greatness does not come from obedience, that discipline can hide behind disorder, that sensitivity often wears the mask of defiance. Robert Mitchum, in Peck's eyes, was never the reckless rebel Hollywood preferred to remember. He was a serious artist, burdened by emotion, sharpened by intelligence, and brave enough to refuse false sincerity. And Gregory Peck, so often cast as a certainty, revealed his own depth by acknowledging that truth. This is why their stories matter, because Hollywood thrives on contrast, but art thrives on complexity. Peck showed us that moral authority does not require judgment, and Mitchum proved that rebellion does not exclude integrity. Together, their legacies form a complete picture of what cinema can be when it dares to tell the truth. Not the comfortable truth, not the marketable truth, but the human one. And that is why, long after the scandals fade, long after the applause quiets, and long after the myths crumble, their performances still linger, not because they were perfect, but because they were real,